Hello, and welcome to the 45th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is the recent growing clamour in the climate change debate and why the science leaves very little room for doubt, while the clock we should be watching is measured in geological time rather than in financial quarters or electoral cycles. The news cycle this past week has been littered with strong opinions about climate risk. The noise has grown louder, the memes snappier, and the talking points more rehearsed. The temptation is to meet a cacophony with a counter-cacophony. We have a different proposal. Let us slow the tempo and move from headlines to baselines. The baseline is physics. The baseline is chemistry. The baseline is the way ice responds to heat, the way oceans store energy, and the way carbon lingers in the atmosphere and in the sea. Once you return to those baselines, the current debate looks less like a conversation and more like a recurring human habit of arguing with the tide. A sober starting point helps. The latest global assessments make two things plain. First, the climate system has crossed a series of new records in the past few years. Surface temperatures are higher than at any time in the instrumental era. Ocean heat content keeps setting new highs, which matters since the ocean is the principal reservoir for the extra energy trapped by greenhouse gases. Sea level continues its steady climb with thermal expansion and land ice loss as the twin drivers. Cryosphere indicators show Greenland and Antarctica shedding mass. Wildfire seasons have lengthened in many regions, and hydrological extremes look more frequent and more intense. Second, the energy transition is real in terms of growth rates for renewables and storage and energy efficiency. It is not yet real in absolute tons of carbon removed from the trajectory. The world still consumes record amounts of fossil energy. That means the rate of addition to the carbon stockpile remains too high. Sincere applause for progress is fine. Accounting for mass and energy is mandatory. Those data points are not a prophecy. They are a description of a system moving from one state toward another under known forcings. Which brings us to time. Human time is counted in years and decades. Geological time is measured in magnitudes of centuries and millennia, with an occasional flourish into millions of years. The trouble begins when we apply the first clock to a system that obeys the second. Carbon dioxide persists. The oceans mix slowly. Ice sheets respond with inertia and with threshold behaviour. Warm the system fast enough, and you can kick off a sequence that keeps unfolding long after the generation that turned the key has left the room. Deep time makes this intuitive. The age of animals spans roughly the last 500 million years. Across that sweep, the planet wandered through icehouse states and greenhouse states. Carbon dioxide levels tracked those swings with remarkable fidelity. Continents shifted. Volcanoes built mountains and then eroded them. Life adapted and sometimes did not. That is not nostalgia for a wilder planet. That is a reminder that the climate machine is powerful and patient. When the carbon dial moves, temperature follows. When temperature moves far enough, ice moves. When ice moves, coastlines shift and ocean circulation can reorganize. None of this is speculative. It is how the Earth has behaved under different carbon regimes throughout geological time. Two facts about that history should frame our present. First, the Holocene, which cradled agriculture and cities and modern economies, is an unusually stable sliver within the larger story. Second, the pulse of carbon we are injecting today is geologically abrupt. Nature has tools that draw carbon down. Those tools take a very long time. The ocean will keep absorbing heat even after emissions stop. Ice sheets will keep finding their new balance with a lag that stretches across centuries. Sea level will keep rising as the system catches up with the energy already banked. The modern conversation often turns on a different clock. We measure success with near-term cost curves and deployment statistics and market share. That is useful as a management dashboard. It can be misleading as a guide to duty. If we judge the adequacy of ambition by the price of a battery next quarter, we miss the central point. The question is whether our total carbon ledger is heading toward a level consistent with ice sheets that remain largely intact and ocean currents that remain broadly familiar to the civilization that built all its coastal infrastructure near a 20th century shoreline. This is why we need to talk about irreversibility in a calm voice. Irreversibility in climate is subtle. If we were to stop emissions outright, some variables would ease downward. Short-lived pollutants would fade first. Temperatures could plateau, then drift a little lower if concentrations declined. The great stores of heat in the ocean would cool slowly. The symmetric picture ends there. Large ice sheets can exhibit hysteresis. Once retreat passes certain configurations, a return to the prior state becomes very hard without much colder conditions. Coral reef systems degrade and recover on ecological timescales that do not align with political calendars. Permafrost thaws and the carbon contained there becomes part of the active cycle. None of these are Hollywood disasters. They are slow, global engineering projects that we are commissioning without a contract for reversal. A fair-minded listener might say that innovation can bend these curves. That is true and welcome. Costs for solar modules, wind turbines, batteries, and electrolyzers have declined and are poised to drop further as learning by doing continues. Heat pumps are efficient and, in many climates, already a better choice on life cycle cost. Smart grids and digital demand response are maturing. Nuclear designs, new and old, are being revisited with an eye to standardization and real-world delivery. Carbon management is broadening from point source capture into a portfolio that includes mineralization and direct air capture for very specific roles. We should accelerate all of this and then accelerate again. Another fair-minded listener might say that development goals for the poorest communities deserve equal weight. That is also true. Energy access prevents needless death. Cooling prevents heat stress. Irrigation stabilizes food supplies. Clean cooking reduces indoor air pollution. As we prioritize projects, the question is not mitigation or development. The question is development through mitigation and resilience so that prosperity does not depend on a fuel that destabilizes the climate on which prosperity rests. Energy abundance is an ally. The source of that abundance is the variable that matters over a century. Let us return to the present debate and a popular view that the world will probably land near 2 to 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century and should focus more energy on adaptation and on bringing down the premium on clean options through innovation. Parts of that view are pragmatic and worth adopting fully. Where it goes astray is the way it frames risk. The framing is dominated by the 21st century. The system we care about includes the 22nd and the 23rd centuries. If the carbon stock remains high, the long tail of heat in the ocean and the slow readjustment of ice and sea level will continue. The human eye sees a plateau at the end of this century, and then a neat, flat line. The ocean sees a very long glide that keeps rising. Our descendants inherit the glide path and the invoice. This is where deep time and near time meet. In deep time, carbon is not a side character. It is the through line. In near time, carbon looks like an accounting nuisance that can be engineered away at some future date. The two perspectives must converge. If we ignore the deep time perspective, we tell ourselves that a slower rate of increase is victory. It is not. Only a sustained decline toward a safe stock is victory. The difference between short-term optimism and long-term safety is the difference between a passable quarter and a livable coastline. Picture coastal cities that plan for 2 to 3 tenths of a metre of sea level rise by mid-century, and then imagine the next 2 centuries with a committed rise that keeps adding centimetres year after year. Even if the rate later slows, the total still grows. Consider mountain glaciers that supply water to large river systems. Their loss does not arrive like a single breaking point. It unfolds as altered seasonality, followed by reduced late-season flows, followed by constraints on irrigation and power generation that compound other risks. Consider heat extremes that push wet bulb temperatures toward thresholds that constrain outdoor labour, or require rethinking building codes and urban design at scale. None of these are solved by a single innovation. They are solved by a portfolio that includes rapid mitigation to minimise total long-term change and serious adaptation to cope with what is already locked in. An honest appraisal of cost should include the time value of avoided irreversibility. We discount money across years. We should be cautious about discounting habitability across centuries. A community that invests today to replace a coal plant with renewables and flexible load and storage does more than avoid tons of carbon. It reduces the long-term probability of passing thresholds in ice and ocean circulation that would rewrite coastlines. A city that builds transport around electrified public options and active mobility reduces local air pollution now and climate risk later. A farm that adopts precision agriculture and restores soil carbon gains resilience to drought now and contributes to a modest but real sink at scale. These are double dividend moves based on infrastructure for stability. The conversation needs a better narrative for responsibility. That narrative begins with the plain statement that the science is unambiguous on the central mechanism. Carbon dioxide traps heat. We have raised its concentration sharply. The energy imbalance at the top of the atmosphere is positive. The system warms until balance is restored at a higher temperature. The distribution of that warming across the system is uneven. The ocean takes the lion's share. That is why marine heat waves have multiplied, and why coral bleaching is a recurring headline. The land warms faster, which is why heat records on continents now outnumber cold records by large ratios in many datasets. The poles warm faster still, which disrupts old patterns of sea ice and snow cover, and influences weather far from the ice. Where models are indispensable is in exploring futures and in guiding choices under uncertainty. The best models do not hand us one future. They give us a set of futures conditioned on our actions. They illuminate ranges, tails, and pathway trade-offs. They allow planners to stress test water systems and power grids and supply chains under a spread of plausible conditions. They expose the false comfort that comes from cherry-picking a mild scenario. They show what it takes to hold warming near the safer end of the range. They remind us that later action needs to be much stronger than earlier action to deliver the same total effect. They reinforce the point that negative emissions are a backstop with narrow use cases and not a substitute for cutting gross emissions quickly. Consider ice. The fate of ice on land is a slow drama with immense downstream consequences. The Greenland ice sheet responds to both air and ocean heat. Marine terminating glaciers are sensitive to the geometry of fjords and to the depth of warm water intrusions. Antarctica is even more subtle with sectors where grounding lines can retreat into deeper basins, which increases ice discharge. Once certain thresholds are crossed, the geometry favours continued retreat even if the original forcing eases. That is hysteresis in action. The time horizon for large changes spans centuries. The decision horizon for avoiding them is now. That is the mismatch that makes climate policy unlike most other domains of public choice. Some argue that presenting such long horizon risks feels abstract to daily life. Perhaps the answer is to lean into examples that matter to health, safety, and prosperity today, while acknowledging their connection to long-term stewardship. Heat kills silently. Floods cause trauma that rarely features in GDP tallies. Smoke from wildfires affects health and cognitive performance. Food prices spike when multiple breadbasket regions face simultaneous stress. Insurance markets reprice risk and sometimes retreat, which then shows up in mortgage markets and in municipal budgets. This is not a parade of horrors. This is a ledger of costs that people already pay. The false dichotomy says we must pick either growth now or climate safety later. The honest plan says we can do both through a redesign of energy, land use, and industry that creates new jobs and avoids damages that erode wealth. Let us talk about innovation with rigor and enthusiasm. We want new chemistry for batteries and for cement, process heat without carbon across temperature ranges, zero carbon fuels for ships, and possibly for aircraft where batteries are not practical for long haul, green steel that can outcompete conventional routes, software that orchestrates millions of small assets as one flexible system, nature restoration that is measured carefully for biodiversity and for carbon, building codes that treat efficiency and passive design as standard practice. In short, we want a lot. We also need to be honest that innovation on its own will not cancel the arithmetic of stocks and flows if deployment is slow. The curve that matters is cumulative emissions. That curve bends only when we install and use cleaner tools at massive scale and retire the most polluting kit early. Adaptation remains essential. The right frame treats adaptation as preparation, not as resignation. Early warning systems save lives. Urban design that cools neighborhoods protects elderly residents and outdoor workers. Coastal buffers and living shorelines reduce storm surge risk. Agricultural extension that spreads drought-tolerant crops and precision irrigation stabilizes yields. Public health systems that prepare for heat waves and vector shifts keep communities safer. Finance that supports these measures in lower-income regions is a moral duty and a pragmatic hedge against instability. All of these factors complement strong mitigation by buying time and reducing harm. Where does this leave the current climate debate? At least for us, it is a state of clarity. Claims that urgent action is alarmism fail a basic test. The science shows that each additional increment of warming increases damages and raises the risk of crossing thresholds with long-lasting outcomes. The pathways that keep those risks in a manageable range demand deep emission cuts this decade and the next. They require structural investment decisions that align with a world that works at low emissions. They ask us to be adults about trade-offs and to be creative about policy design so that households and firms can make better choices with less friction. They ask leaders to speak plainly about why a stable climate is not a luxury preference. It is the stage on which all other goals perform. A narrative that truly serves future generations will blend three elements. First, a respect for the baselines of earth science and deep time. Second, a commitment to human development that uses clean energy to lift living standards rather than using poverty as an alibi for delay. Third, a dedication to innovation and deployment at a pace that matches the problem rather than the comfortable cadence of old capital cycles. Let's offer a perspective that helps with resolve. The world has already changed part of the story. The cost of clean electricity is now competitive in many settings. Electric vehicles are moving from novelty to mainstream in multiple markets, including the world's largest in China. Heat pumps and induction stoves are gaining share. Methane reduction in oil and gas operations is an obvious and cheap win with immediate benefits for radiative forcing. Grid operators are learning to manage higher shares of variable renewables with storage and flexible demand. These show that success is possible and that the stubborn parts of the transition are now concentrated in specific sectors and specific policy puzzles. One final thought on time. We inherit a planet that writes its history in stone and ice and sediment. We respond with quarterly earnings and campaign cycles and news feeds that refresh every minute. That mismatch can produce either despair or discipline. Despair says the problem is too big. Discipline says the problem is big, and that is exactly why we must choose early moves that compound. Install clean capacity today, and it avoids emissions every hour for decades. Upgrade an industrial process now, and it locks in lower emissions for the life of the plant. Plant a mangrove belt this year, and it buffers coasts and stores carbon while creating habitat for generations. These are choices that last. Our position says the science is clear. The climate responds to carbon in ways that are well understood. The system has inertia and thresholds that extend consequences beyond our line of sight. Claims that urgency is alarmism confuse discomfort with danger. Urgency is the appropriate response to long-lived risk. Net zero is an instruction to the entire economy to match the physics of the planet that hosts it. If we do this work with confidence and care, we get cleaner air, more resilient systems, new industries, and fewer regrets. If we delay, we leave a century of chronic adjustments to those who never had a vote in the matter. Well, that's a wrap on episode 45 of the GreenWave podcast. You already know we appreciate you sharing your time. Finding us has never been easier on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. You've been formally invited to love the pod, share with friends, and leave a review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.